That indeed has never happened to me before, where somebody has said, in response to my slides, is that enough? But I'll try hard to make sure that I don't use more than my allotted time. You know, I actually thought I'd go last. So I spent most of my time thinking about this session in this way. I tried to think about all the things that I could say when everything interesting had already been said, when I thought I would go last. So now I'm first, and I get to say all the things I didn't intend to. So interesting dynamic. Hey, just a question. I like to ask this question anytime I speak, and it's fairly frequently. It's a simple question. When you hear AACSB, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Costly. What else? Come on. Process, accreditation, quality. Anybody? What's that? Efforts. So I've been doing that for about 3 years now, different audiences, academics, corporates, et cetera. Not once has anybody ever said innovation. Not one single time. I don't know if anybody heard what my title is at AACSB. It's Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer. So you can imagine the challenge that we face. But AACSB's mission, some of you may be surprised if you don't already know this, is that we foster engagement. So in particular, engagement of academia with practice. So we're making an effort to do this. Secondly, we accelerate innovation. How hard is that for a body, for an organization that's best known for accreditation? Accreditation doesn't scream innovation, does it? In fact, we think accreditation ought to be an enabler of innovation rather than a stifler of innovation. And then finally, we amplify impact in business education. So the things that you do, we try to amplify, make even more impactful and more visible. That's AACSB. We do this by connecting not only business schools to each other, 1,600 of them, but we do it by more and more connecting business schools to practice. So I'm going to jump right in and talk about how I dealt with this subject. So the topic is basically how do we, as business schools, foster creativity and innovation? That was the question. So I thought about my experiences when I visit business schools. I ask questions. We talk about things. We talk about not only the past, but the future, what kinds of things you want to do. And I tried to crystallize in my mind what I thought would be the best approach to this. And the way I thought about it was, what I typically see is a lot of innovation. A lot of innovation, but it's not very complete. It's a lot of good ideas that are just starting, and it's not very diffuse. So it doesn't make its way to other schools. That's what I typically see. So what I thought I'd talk about here is what I see in terms of the opportunity to unlock the full potential. So a lot of schools are doing some interesting things to build creativity, but they're not reaching their full potential. How do we do that? That's what I thought. And I thought I'd give you 3 keys to unlocking the full potential. And I'm going to start by saying the evidence with creativity, and especially with innovation, is clear. The evidence is clear. There's no ambiguity that creativity and innovation are social phenomena. Research by Jane Dutton, for example, positive energy translates into what? More cooperative behavior. It translates into less fighting and bolder ideas when you work in teams. Positive energy. It's a social phenomenon. When McKinsey, more diverse teams translate into better results and more creative solutions. The research is clear. Even in academia, researchers, a fellow named Uzi and a team, they studied 20 million articles in science, so in the sciences area. 20 million, and about 1.9 million patents that were filed. What did they find? They found over time that scholars are more and more working in teams. The number of co-authors increased from about, on average, 1.9 to 3.5 co-authors. And they also found that articles written by multiple authors were more likely to be cited. They were twice as likely to be cited. They were 6 times more likely to be home run articles in the sense of more than 100 citations. So even in academia, the evidence is clear. Creativity, innovation is a social phenomenon. Ron Burt. How many of you have heard of Ron Burt? Sociologist that studies social networks. Right? He studied companies and their social networks. So companies typically have bunches of people that stick closely together. These little bunches of people, pretty cohesive groups, right? They are rather homogeneous and they understand similar things. Well, what Ron Burt's research has found is that people who bridge these groups, what he calls structural holes, people that bridge these groups, he calls them brokers, are unfortunately higher risk of having better ideas. Brokers, people that bridge structural holes, are higher risk of having better ideas. He also found a number of things. I want to make sure I get this right. They are more likely to express their ideas if they're brokers. They're less likely to have that idea dismissed, and they're more likely to have the idea assessed as adding value. Again, the evidence is clear. It's social. Now, why do I say this? Because when I go to schools and we have this conversation about creativity, what do we talk about? We start with the conversation, well, somebody normally would say, creativity can't be learned. You're either born with it or you're not. It's an attribute of an individual, right? The conversation usually revolves around a course, and a person can take that course to build her creativity skills. It's very individual-centered. It's a 21st century skill that individuals must somehow build and acquire, and we can support that. To me, that's rather limiting, and let me tell you why. And this is, of the 3 keys, to me this is the most conceptual, but the most important. So, think about the conversation so far. We talk about selecting people that are more naturally inclined to creativity, right? It's about nature rather than about nurture, right? So everything revolves around the individual. The evidence, though, is that it's social. So what does this mean for business schools? The good news, this is what really excites me about business education, is that's what we're all about in business schools, isn't it? The social. What is management? It's about getting things done through other people. What do we do normally in our curricula? We try to structure teams, right, to tackle projects, don't we? We know that management is social. If we just think creativity is social, it unlocks a lot of potential. Let me give you a couple of examples. So, Dell Medical School. How many of you have heard of Dell Medical School? Dell Medical School is a new medical school at a research university, and they decided their purpose in life is to graduate physicians not to go to work in the existing system, but to change the existing system. Right? So they have a problem. They need to decide who to admit in their first class. So do you think they went out and tried to admit the same type of people that any other medical school would? The highest MCAT scores, the most accomplished scholars in science? No, they went after social entrepreneurs. They went after a set of people with different experiences. They were very purposeful about the people they brought together in their first class because they realized that learning is going to be social. It's a very important thing. We tend, so we're only one step away, we tend in our classrooms to put together homogeneous people working on business problems, right? Think about some of the examples we've seen so far. Where I've seen the most interesting innovation is when we bring together business students with non-business students to tackle a problem that's beyond business. Something that's related to a wicked problem a community is facing. That type of learning is not terribly different than the kind of learning that Scott DeRue is expressing. So the first key, I think, is for us to recognize, to acknowledge that creativity and innovation are very much social phenomena. If we can do that, it takes us a long way. But now the second key, and I see this all the time, and if you're gonna unlock your full potential, this is very, very important. What I see all the time is that there's pockets of innovation, but it's stifled by other parts of the curriculum. There are 4 parts to the curriculum, right? There's content, there's pedagogy, there's structure, and there's purpose. So since I thought everybody else would talk about pedagogy, I thought I'd talk about the other 3. So content. There's evidence that suggests that leaders who are more focused on operational efficiency and the short term are more likely to dismiss ideas with long-term potential. So in one part of the curriculum, we teach creativity. In another part of the curriculum, we're focused on operational efficiency. Which one's going to win? Which one's going to win? Aligning the pieces of the curriculum. Aligning the pieces of the curriculum. In a second example, it's related here. I want to make sure I get this in the order that we want. If we take something like purpose, and we look at the SDGs, the SDGs are about a $12 million business opportunity. Right? How many of you have heard that figure? The SDGs is about a $12 trillion business opportunity. But yet, when we bring together teams, I mentioned this earlier, when we bring together teams, we typically bring them together to tackle business problems, not the social ones. So when we talk about business education, we're often criticized for what? A focus on profits and shareholder wealth rather than a focus on things like global prosperity. We're focused on wealth creation in some ways at the expense of the environment, at the expense of inclusion. So as soon as we elevate the problem, as soon as we create a superordinate problem, we begin to think about things a little bit differently and we create new opportunities. Here's another example of structure. So how many of you have heard of Singapore University of Technology and Design? It's an engineering school without the word engineering in its title. What they did was they said, look, we are going to encourage creativity. We're going to do design thinking, all that kind of stuff. And they said, but we have a problem. There's so much we stuff into the curriculum, there's no time. Right? So what did they do? They created something they called the 5th row. So every day there's structured time where they don't have to be in classes and structured time for them to interact and to create new things. Right? So they've actually been very purposeful about the structure. Typically, when business schools have a course, they leave little time for that kind of interaction. They also create a makerspace. So if you want your business students to be more creative, why not create a space where they can make things? Why not give them coding experience so that they could actually implement some of their ideas? Right? So it's about creating structure that complements that. Now the third is to be more purposeful about the culture. I can't emphasize this one enough. What I see at business schools, recall that point about Jane Dutton. More positive energy creates bolder ideas. In an environment where there's a lot of competition, for example, where there's a lot of negative energy, we might create those types of environments in our business schools. Less cooperative, more competitive. Those typically don't foster creativity, right? Finally, look, when we're talking about creativity and innovation, what matters most? It's success or failure? What matters most, success or failure? Failure. failure. But all of our programs, all of our cultures are built on a culture of success, right? You know you've made it when you succeeded, right? And we want to encourage people through success, but we don't build in failure into our culture. So be purposeful about culture. Make sure that's a part of what you... Separation. How many business schools want to emphasize creativity and innovation, but then isolate themselves from the rest of the university campus or the business community? Right? Physically isolate themselves. Where I see the most innovation in being able to foster creativity is when business schools are right in the middle of the action, where there are diverse communities trying to solve difficult problems. So why do we separate ourselves from the university? We had this discussion, right? Who has the advantage in the new age of business education? University-based business schools or standalone ones? It's the university-based business schools because that's where the connections are, and that's where the social dimension matters. And then finally, I can't help but mention faculty are part of the culture, and when faculty are working in silos, it sends a different signal about the emphasis on creativity. So if I had to give you 3 suggestions about creativity and innovation, it's yes, do the pedagogies like experiential learning, but make sure everything is aligned. Otherwise, it's going to be a waste. That's the main message of this. Make sure you start with the assumption that it's social, build on that, align everything, and then you'll be all set. Now, I did want to mention, I think a lot of what I just said sounds a lot like what Scott says. The future of business education really is creating the space for creativity and innovation and allowing business students and others to pull content, to pull resources on demand throughout an educational life cycle. So,
Thank you very much, Dan.